Hello, today we're in the offices of DLA Piper in central London, and we're going to be talking about whistleblowing policy with one of the world's leading thinkers on the subject, Pattie Walsh. Thank you so much for inviting us in today.
It's a pleasure.
Just set the scene for us. Why is whistleblowing suddenly such a hot topic?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that in terms of around the world and the whole global interest in whistleblowing, that's obviously been fueled by some of the very high profile whistleblowing cases. We've seen huge fines for certain organisations. We've had lots of debates about the role of the whistleblower. And of course, with social media, with the way information moves globally, that's excited interest in corners where it wasn't excited before. I think that the truth is that there's many jurisdictions where the debate is ongoing about the role of the whistleblower. I think perhaps one of the most interesting jurisdictions is China. Having worked in Asia for 10 years, and in DLA Piper we've got teams operating in China, we've been very touched and caught by the interest in the whole whistleblowing debate. And the indication is that individuals in China are starting to speak up and speak out. And this also involves going internationally and using the external regulatory organisations, using the press, and some might say holding certain organisations to ransom. And that seems to be somewhat inconsistent with the environment of control within China. So I think that's one of the more interesting areas.
Taking into consideration the different cultures and laws that exist around whistleblowing, depending on which jurisdiction you're operating in, is there a one-size-fits-all policy which companies can adopt?
One of the big challenges is that every country approaches this in a very different way. The legal situation is very, very different from place to place. Even if we were to compare Japan and China and Hong Kong, you have an entirely different regulatory approach to whistleblowing. Perhaps surprisingly, in Hong Kong, which is one of the most corrupt-free organisations or places in Asia, there is no express whistleblowing protection. So I think, unfortunately, the devil is in the detail and no one size fits all. You have to look at your operations and take into account the local environment in which you're operating.
You talked about the distinction between culture and law. They really are two very different considerations, aren't they?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's culture in terms of corporate culture, but there's also the culture of the environment and the country and the place where the organisation is located. So just by way of example, I was recently having a debate during a global webinar where we were talking about some research that we'd been doing at DLA Piper, and the approach to whistleblowing in Germany and France is very different from the approach in the US and the UK. And some of the continental European countries feel that the whole concept of anonymous reporting or individuals going off and making sometimes unsubstantiated allegations is very unsavoury. And I think in different countries, the importance of individual privacy is seen as being much more influential than in others. And I think the other point that's important to put all of this into context, when we talk about the US and we talk about their detailed whistleblowing protection, there's also an interplay between local employment law and employment protection. So in the US they have at-will employment, so employees can be terminated literally at will. In other countries where you have very protected employee legislation, local law, then query whether there's the same need for express protection if they blow the whistle. The importance of Australian culture, for example, the idea that you don't dob your mate in it, so keep it at home. So critical, culture's critical.
Pattie, quite often there may be a situation where an employee witnesses behaviour which may not necessarily be illegal, but is certainly making them feel very uncomfortable. What's the advice to those individuals?
Employees won't always necessarily know whether or not the behaviour or the conduct that they're witnessing justifies or is caught by a whistleblowing policy or procedure. And I think it's important to think about whistleblowing and the protection for whistleblowers in the context of all the other protections for employees in terms of their right to be employed in an environment that isn't discriminatory. So there'll be equal opportunities policy, not to be bullied or harassed. There are obligations to provide redress through a grievance procedure. And so I think that for individuals who don't know where to go because this seems such a complex problem and which policy applies, they would generally be encouraged to go and speak to their local HR support individual on the ground. And again, it should be made absolutely clear to them whether they're under the right policy or the wrong policy isn't the point. The point is they have a concern that needs to be taken seriously.
So to summarise, what are the real take-out messages that you would want HR directors and company directors to understand around this issue?
Notwithstanding that this is a complicated topic and there are cultural variations and there are variations from country to country, it's critical that HR, which is the custodian of the integrity of the business, looks at whistleblowing and corporate compliance from a global perspective. I think you have to start with a very clear and principled approach to the way you do business. A commitment from the very top to conduct business in line with that principled approach. And then, of course, underneath that, you have all the mechanisms to support those individuals who have concerns about the way business is being handled and conducted. At the most simple level, you would have a whistleblowing guide or policy, whistleblowing hotline, controversial in some countries, but adopted by some organisations globally. So I think it's simple. Get your culture right, commit to certain action, and then implement, and make sure that you basically live by your own principles.
Pattie, thank you very much for your time today.